The aroma of freshly made tamales filled the small dining room as the Rodriguez family gathered around the table. 11-year-old Diego, his messy black hair flopping into his eyes, eagerly spooned salsa onto his plate. Across from him, 6-year-old Sofia giggled as she tried to balance her glass of horchata with her tiny hands. Mateo, the eldest at 16, leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone but glancing up every so often with a teasing smile for his younger siblings. Maria, their mother, placed the last dish on the table and wiped her hands on her apron, her face weary but soft with love. Luis, their father, folded his hands to lead the family in prayer. It was a lively, typical evening for the Rodriguezes, who had made a modest home in their Texas neighborhood. Despite their humble circumstances, their house was always filled with laughter, warmth, and the smell of Maria's cooking. But underneath the surface, an unspoken fear lingered. The Rodriguezes were undocumented immigrants, constantly living under the threat of being torn apart by forces beyond their control. As Luis began the prayer, Maria's eyes darted to the window, her ears straining to catch any unusual noise. The events of the past week weighed heavily on her mind. She had heard about an ICE raid just 3 streets over. Families, good people she had known from church, had been taken away in the dead of night, their children left crying on the sidewalk. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she crossed herself, a whispered "Amen" escaping her lips. After the prayer, Maria took her seat and cleared her throat. "I want to talk to all of you," she said, her voice calm but firm. Diego looked up from his plate, curious, while Sofia busied herself with her food. Mateo sighed, setting his phone down reluctantly. "There have been more raids in the neighborhood," Maria began, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "I don't want you playing too far from home, Diego. And Mateo, you need to keep your phone on you at all times." She turned to Luis, her voice faltering. "If anything happens, we meet at the church, okay? No matter what." Luis nodded solemnly. "Nothing will happen, Maria. We've been careful." But Maria's expression didn't change. That's what everyone says until it happens. The mood at the table shifted, the laughter dimming as the weight of Maria's words settled over them. Diego put down his fork, his brow furrowed. "But Mama, why would they come for us? We haven't done anything wrong." Maria reached across the table to take Diego's hand. "I know, mijo, but sometimes the world doesn't care about what's right. That's why we have to look out for each other. Always." Before Diego could respond, a loud knock at the door shattered the fragile calm. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. Luis stood slowly, his face pale. "Stay here," he whispered, moving toward the door. Maria grabbed Sofia, holding her close, while Mateo positioned himself protectively in front of Diego. The knocking turned to pounding, and then a voice boomed from outside. "ICE! Open the door!" Panic erupted. Maria pushed Sofia into Diego's arms. "Take your sister to the back room! Mateo, go with them!" she ordered, her voice shaking but firm. The children scrambled to obey, but before they could reach the hallway, the door burst open with a crash. Uniformed officers flooded the small house, shouting commands in English and Spanish. "Hands where we can see them!" one officer yelled, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Luis raised his hands, his voice trembling as he tried to explain in broken English. "Please, no trouble. My family, we—" Maria stepped forward, shielding her husband with her body. "Por favor, no somos criminales," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. In the chaos, Diego clung to Sofia, his heart pounding. Mateo stood in front of them, his fists clenched, as if he could fight off the officers with sheer will. An officer spotted them and moved closer, his gaze cold and unyielding. "You kids, come here!" he barked. "No!" Maria cried out, trying to push past another officer, but she was shoved back roughly. Luis shouted in protest, only to be handcuffed and dragged toward the door. Diego's world spun as he and Sofia were pulled apart. "Mateo!" he screamed, reaching for his brother, but Mateo was already being restrained by another officer. "Let them go! They're just children!" Maria sobbed, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. The Rodriguez family was herded outside into the cold night, their neighbors peeking through curtains and cracked doors, but too afraid to intervene. The officers separated them into different vehicles. Diego's small hand pressed against the window as he watched his mother and father disappear into the back of another van. Sofia sat beside him, her tiny body trembling as she cried, silently. Mateo was nowhere to be seen. For the first time in his life, Diego felt utterly helpless. The drive to the detention center was silent except for Sophia's quiet sobs. Diego wrapped his arm around her, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "We'll find Mama and Papa," he said, his voice cracking. "I promise, Sophie. We'll be together again." When they arrived, the siblings were separated, despite Diego's protests. He was led down a sterile hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. A man in a uniform handed him a blanket and pointed to a small room, filled with other children. "Stay here," the man said curtly, shutting the door behind him. Diego looked around the room, his heart sinking. Dozens of children, some as young as Sophia, sat huddled on thin mats. The air was heavy with fear and confusion. Diego sat in a corner, clutching the blanket tightly. He wanted to cry, to scream, but he forced himself to stay strong. For Sophia, for Mateo, for his parents. That night, as Diego lay on the cold floor, staring at the dim light overhead, he made a silent vow. No matter what it took, he would reunite his family. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to try. They had always been strongest together, and he wouldn't let anyone take that away from them. The following morning, Diego woke to the quiet hum of whispers in the dimly lit room. He watched as a small boy sat huddled near the wall, clutching a worn photograph. The child's tear-streaked face mirrored Diego's own despair. Diego hesitated, then shuffled closer, his curiosity outweighing his apprehension. "What's wrong?" he asked softly in Spanish. The boy looked up, startled. For a moment he said nothing, only holding the photograph tighter. Finally, his trembling voice broke the silence. "They took my mama. She said she'd be right behind me, but she never came." A lump formed in Diego's throat. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions at bay. "I'm Diego," he offered, sitting beside the boy. "What's your name?" "Luis," the boy whispered. His small fingers traced the edges of the photograph, as though it was his last connection to his mother. Diego glanced at the picture. A smiling woman with arms wrapped tightly around a little boy who looked just like Luis. The sight made his chest ache. "We're going to be okay," Diego said, more for himself than for the boy. "We have to be strong. Our families are counting on us." Hours turned into days, and Diego adjusted to the strange rhythm of the detention center. Meals were sparse and tasteless, and the children spent most of their time confined to the room. Diego occupied himself by helping the younger ones, sharing whispers of reassurance, even when his own hope faltered. In the quiet moments, he stared out the small, barred window, wondering where Sophia and Mateo were, if they were scared, if they were safe. Each day felt like an eternity, but Diego refused to let despair take hold. One afternoon, a woman in a crisp suit entered the room, her clipboard tucked tightly under her arm. She called out names, her voice clipped and formal. "Diego Rodriguez?" Diego's heart leapt into his throat. He scrambled to his feet, his voice trembling as he answered, Here." The woman gestured for him to follow. As he walked down the sterile hallways, his mind raced. Was this about his family? Had they found Mama and Papa? He was led into a small office where a kind-faced woman sat behind a desk. Her warm smile contrasted with the cold, clinical environment. "Hello, Diego," she said gently. "I'm Ms. Flores. I'm here to help you." Diego's hands fidgeted in his lap. "Can you find my Mama and Papa?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Flores leaned forward, her expression earnest. "That's what we're working on, but it might take some time." Time. The word felt like a cruel joke. Diego's shoulders sagged, but he nodded. If waiting meant he could see his family again, he would endure it. For them, he would do anything. The clock in the small office ticked loudly, filling the silence as Ms. Flores waited for Diego's reaction. He nodded slowly, though his chest tightened at the thought of time. How long? Weeks? Months? His mind swirled with questions, but he couldn't bring himself to ask. Instead, he clutched the edge of his chair, his knuckles white. "Where's my sister?" Diego's voice was barely audible, but Ms. Flores heard him clearly. Her expression softened. "Your sister is safe, Diego," she replied. "She's with another group of children in a different wing. For now, you'll stay here, but I'll do my best to bring you back together soon." "And Mateo?" Diego pressed. His brother's absence gnawed at him like a wound that wouldn't close. Mateo had always been his protector, the one who cracked jokes when things got too serious, who stood tall and unflinching when Diego felt small. Ms. Flores hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We're looking into his case. He's a bit older, so he's likely in a facility for teenagers. But I promise I'll let you know as soon as I have any updates." Diego's chest ached, but he forced himself to nod. He had to trust her, even though every fiber of his being screamed to do something, anything, to take control. He clenched his fists under the table, hiding his trembling hands. "Do you have any questions for me?" Ms. Flores asked gently. He shook his head, his throat too tight to speak. She offered him a small, reassuring smile and slid a piece of paper across the desk. "This is my contact information. If you think of anything or need someone to talk to, tell one of the staff to call me. Okay?" Diego took the paper, his fingers brushing the smooth surface. It felt like a lifeline, fragile but real. He slipped it into his pocket, muttered a quiet, "Gracias," and followed the guard back to the room where the other children were waiting. That night, Diego lay awake on the thin mat, staring at the flickering fluorescent light above him. Around him, the muffled sounds of restless children filled the room. Soft sniffles, occasional murmurs, the rustle of blankets. Luis, the boy he had befriended, slept curled up nearby, clutching his photograph as if it were a talisman. Diego's thoughts drifted to Sofia. Was she scared? Crying for Mama? He pictured her small hands clutching her stuffed bunny, the way she used to when she couldn't sleep. His heart ached at the thought of her being alone. Mateo's absence felt like a gaping hole in his chest. Diego's brother had always been strong, unshakable. If Mateo were here, he'd know what to do. Diego's fingers brushed against the scrap of paper in his pocket. Ms. Flores' words echoed in his mind. Time. But how much time could they afford? Every moment spent apart felt like a thread, unraveling from the fabric of their family. He couldn't let it come undone. Days blurred together, each one marked by the same routine: sparse meals, brief outdoor breaks under the watchful eyes of guards, and restless nights in the crowded room. Diego fell into a rhythm of quiet observation, watching and waiting for any opportunity to gather information or make connections. He listened carefully to the whispers of other children, piecing together fragments of stories. Some spoke of reunions, others of families sent back to places they had fled in fear. The uncertainty weighed on everyone like a heavy cloud. Luis became Diego's shadow, clinging to him as they navigated the unfamiliar environment. The younger boy's dependence gave Diego a sense of purpose, a reason to stay strong even when doubt threatened to consume him. He told Luis stories about their families finding them, painting vivid pictures of warm hugs and happy endings. Luis believed every word, his wide-eyed trust a fragile spark of hope. One afternoon, during their outdoor break, Diego overheard two older boys talking near the fence. Their voices were low, but Diego caught snippets of their conversation. "They're moving some kids tomorrow," one of them said, his tone hushed. "I heard it's to a bigger place, more crowded." "Doesn't matter," the other replied. "Once you're there, it's even harder to find anyone. My cousin got sent to one of those places last year. Never heard from him again." Diego's stomach turned. The thought of being moved, of losing whatever slim chance he had of finding Sofia or Mateo, made his chest tighten. He clenched his fists, determination hardening in his gut. He couldn't let that happen. That night, as the room settled into uneasy quiet, Diego made his decision. He had to act. Waiting wasn't enough. He couldn't rely on promises or time. He needed to find a way to reach his family, to let them know he was still here, still fighting to bring them back together. The next morning, Diego approached a guard during breakfast. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his face stern but not unkind. Diego took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage he had. "Excuse me," he said in halting English. "Can you help me call Ms. Flores? I need to talk to her." The guard raised an eyebrow, glancing down at the small boy before nodding. "Stay here," he said, walking away to make the call. Minutes felt like hours as Diego waited, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, the guard returned and gestured for him to follow. Diego's legs felt unsteady as he walked to the same small office where he had first met Ms. Flores. She was already there, her expression warm but tinged with concern. "Diego," she said, motioning for him to sit. "What's wrong?" Diego sat stiffly, his hands clenched in his lap. "They said kids are being moved," he blurted out. "If they move me, I won't find Sofia or Mateo. Please, you have to help me." Ms. Flores leaned forward, her brow furrowing. "Diego," I understand how scared you must feel, but moving children is sometimes necessary to keep things organized. It doesn't mean you won't be able to see your family again. You don't understand! Diego's voice cracked, tears stinging his eyes. Sophia's just a little girl. She needs me. Mateo, he's all alone too. We're supposed to stay together. Mama always said, family is everything. Ms. Flores reached across the table, her hand resting gently on Diego's. Diego, I promise you, I'm doing everything I can to reunite your family. I'll make sure you stay here for now, and I'll push to get you back with Sophia as soon as possible. Diego swallowed hard, nodding even though his chest still felt heavy. Ms. Flores' words were kind, but they didn't erase the fear gnawing at him. Still, he had no choice but to trust her, for now. Back in the crowded room, Diego sat in his usual corner. Luis nestled beside him. The younger boy looked up, his eyes filled with quiet curiosity. Did she say we'll see them soon? Luis asked. Diego hesitated, then forced a small smile. She's trying, he said. We just have to be patient. But as Luis nodded and rested his head against Diego's shoulder, Diego's mind raced. Patience wasn't enough. He needed a plan, a way to ensure his family stayed within reach. No matter what it took, he would find them. They were all that mattered. Diego's resolve hardened in the days that followed his conversation with Ms. Flores. The sterile detention center walls seemed to close in around him, but he refused to let them break him. Every time he saw Luis clutch his photograph or heard another child cry softly into the night, his determination to find his family grew stronger. He began observing the guards more closely, memorizing their routines and paying attention to their conversations. Diego wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he needed something, anything, that could help him. He asked careful questions of the older boys who had been there longer, piecing together fragments of knowledge about how the system worked. One evening, during their brief outdoor break, Diego spotted a group of children huddled near the far corner of the yard. They were whispering, their heads bent close together. Curious, he approached cautiously. What's going on? Diego asked in a low voice. A girl with braids and sharp eyes glanced up at him. What do you want? She asked, her tone guarded. I just want to know, Diego said, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. Maybe I can help. The girl studied him for a moment before nodding. We're talking about ways to get messages to our families, she said. Some of us know addresses or phone numbers. If we can find someone who'll help us, maybe we can get word out. Diego's heart leapt. I know my family's church, he said quickly. If someone could get a message there, they'd know what to do. The girl raised an eyebrow. And how do you think you're going to do that? I don't know yet, Diego admitted. But if we work together, maybe we can figure it out. The group murmured among themselves, their skepticism clear. But before they could dismiss him, another boy spoke up. He's right. We can't just sit here waiting for something to happen, the boy said. He was tall and lanky, with a scar running down his cheek. If we don't try, we'll never know. The girl sighed but nodded reluctantly. Fine, you're in, she said to Diego. But if you mess this up, you're on your own. Over the next few days, the group worked quietly but diligently. They pooled their knowledge, sharing what little they knew about the guards and the staff. Diego discovered that one of the kitchen workers, a kind older woman named Señora Castillo, sometimes spoke to the children in Spanish when the guards weren't paying attention. She seemed sympathetic, and Diego wondered if she might be willing to help. It took him 2 days to work up the courage to approach her. During breakfast, as she handed him a tray, he leaned in and whispered, Por favor, necesito su ayuda. Señora Castillo's eyes flickered with surprise, but she didn't respond. She simply nodded slightly and moved on to the next child. Diego's heart sank. Maybe he had misjudged her. But later that day, during lunch, she slipped him an extra piece of bread and whispered, Después del trabajo, en el patio. After work, in the yard. Diego's pulse quickened. He nodded subtly, careful not to draw attention. That evening, as the children were ushered into the yard for their outdoor break, Diego hung back, waiting for Señora Castillo. She appeared a few minutes later, carrying a trash bag. Pretending to empty a bin, she gestured for him to come closer. ¿Qué necesitas, niño? She asked softly, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. Diego swallowed hard. I need to get a message to my family, he said. They don't know where I am. My little sister is here somewhere, and my brother, I don't even know where they took him. Please, señora, can you help? Señora Castillo's expression softened. She looked at Diego for a long moment before nodding. Escribe el mensaje, she said. I'll see what I can do. Diego's hands trembled as he wrote a short note on the scrap of paper she provided. He included the name of his family's church and begged anyone who received the message to let his parents know where he was. He handed it back to her, his heart pounding. Gracias, he whispered. Señora Castillo nodded and tucked the note into her pocket. Ten cuidado, she warned. Be careful. Days passed with no word, and Diego's hope began to waver. He kept himself busy, helping Luis and keeping an eye on the younger children, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Every time the door to the room opened, his heart leapt, only to sink again when it was just another guard or staff member. Then, one afternoon, Ms. Flores returned. She called Diego's name, and he scrambled to his feet, his pulse racing. She led him to the same small office, her expression unreadable. Diego, she said as they sat down, I have some news. Diego's breath caught in his throat. Did you find them, my family? Ms. Flores hesitated, then nodded. Your sister Sofia has been located. She's still in the same facility, and I'm working on getting you reunited. As for your brother Mateo, he's in a facility for older teens. It's further away, but he's safe. Relief and frustration warred within Diego. Sofia was close, but Mateo was still out of reach. What about my parents? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Flores sighed. They've been moved to a detention center in another state. It's going to take more time to connect with them. Diego's chest tightened, but he forced himself to nod. At least they were alive. That was something. I'll do everything I can to speed up the process, Ms. Flores promised. But I need you to stay strong, Diego. Your family is counting on you. Diego straightened in his chair, his resolve hardening once more. I will, he said firmly. I won't give up. Diego left Ms. Flores' office with a mix of emotions swirling in his chest. Sofia was close, Mateo was safe, and his parents, at least they were alive. But the idea of being separated for much longer was unbearable. He returned to the room where the other children waited, his steps heavy, but his determination intact. Luis noticed his somber expression immediately. Did they find them? The boy asked quietly, his wide eyes searching Diego's face. They found Sofia, Diego said, forcing a small smile. She's still here, in another part of the center. And Mateo, he's far, but he's okay. Luis nodded, his small shoulders relaxing a little. That's good, right? Yeah, Diego murmured. But the ache in his chest remained. Over the next few days, Diego became restless. Knowing Sofia was so close, but being unable to see her, felt like a cruel joke. He tried to keep busy, helping Luis and the other younger children, but his thoughts were always elsewhere. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering if Sofia was doing the same. One evening, during their outdoor break, Diego noticed a new staff member, a young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. She was speaking softly to a small group of children, crouching down to their level. Something about her reminded him of his mother, and before he knew it, he was walking toward her. Excuse me, he said in Spanish, his voice tentative. Can I talk to you? The woman turned to him, her smile gentle. Of course. What's your name? Diego, he said. I need to see my sister. Her name is Sofia. She's here, in another part of the center. Please, can you help me? The woman's expression softened. Diego, I'm not sure if I can do that, but I'll ask. Let me see what I can find out. Okay? Thank you, Diego said, his voice barely above a whisper. He watched as she walked away, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. The next morning, as Diego sat with Luis during breakfast, the same woman appeared at the door. She beckoned to him, and he quickly got to his feet. Come with me, she said, her smile encouraging. Diego followed her through the hallways, his heart racing. She led him to a small room with a table and 2 chairs. Wait here, she said. I'll be back soon. Minutes felt like hours as Diego sat alone, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Finally, the door opened, and his breath caught in his throat. Diego! Sofia's voice was like music to his ears. She ran toward him, her small arms outstretched, and he caught her in a tight hug. Tears streamed down both their faces as they clung to each other. I missed you so much, Sophia sobbed, her face buried in his shoulder. I missed you too, Diego whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Are you okay? Have they been treating you well? Sophia nodded, wiping her tears. I'm okay, but I was so scared, Diego. I thought I'd never see you again. I'm here now, he said firmly, and I'm not going anywhere. For the next hour, the siblings talked and laughed, their bond stronger than ever. Diego told Sophia about Luis and the other children, and Sophia shared stories about the kind woman who had been looking after her. It was the first time in weeks that Diego felt a glimmer of hope. When the time came to say goodbye, Diego held Sophia close. I'll see you again soon, he promised, and we'll find Mama and Papa. I swear it. The reunion with Sophia gave Diego a renewed sense of purpose. He threw himself into helping the other children, sharing his hope and determination with anyone who would listen. Even Luis seemed more cheerful, his belief in Diego unshakable. But Diego knew the road ahead was still long. Mateo was still far away, and their parents. The thought of them alone in a distant detention center made his chest ache. He had to find a way to bring them all back together, and he wouldn't stop until he did. The days following his reunion with Sophia felt like both a blessing and a curse for Diego. The brief glimpse of hope filled him with new energy, but it also deepened his desperation. Every moment apart from Mateo and their parents felt heavier now that he knew the odds of reuniting them all. He couldn't let himself dwell on the fear. Instead, he focused on planning. Diego's nights became restless. While other children slept, he lay awake, replaying every word he'd heard from Ms. Flores, the staff, and even the older boys who whispered about transfers and deportations. He knew the system worked slowly, but he also knew delays could mean losing his family forever. One evening, as he sat quietly in the corner of the recreation area, Luis came over and plopped down beside him. You're thinking about them, aren't you? Luis asked softly. Diego nodded. I don't know what to do. Sophia's here, but Mateo and my parents are so far away. What if something happens to them before I can reach them? Luis frowned, his small face scrunching in thought. You're going to find them. You're smart, smarter than anyone here. Diego gave him a small smile, though doubt gnawed at him. Thanks, Luis, but I'm not sure being smart is enough. Luis leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. What if we find a way to leave, like all of us? Diego blinked in surprise. Leave? You mean escape? Luis nodded, his eyes shining with determination. If we stay here, nothing will change. But if we leave, maybe we can find someone who will help us get to your parents. Diego's heart raced. The idea was wild, risky, and almost impossible. But as he stared into Luis's hopeful eyes, a seed of possibility began to take root. That night, Diego began to pay even closer attention to the guards and staff. He noted their shifts, the doors they used, and the patterns of their movements. During outdoor breaks, he walked the perimeter of the fenced yard, looking for weak points. He spoke quietly with some of the older boys, careful not to reveal too much but hoping to gather useful information. One of the boys, a wiry teen named Ernesto, gave him a knowing look after Diego asked about the fence. Why do you want to know? Ernesto asked. Diego hesitated. Just curious, he said, in case there's a way to get a message out. Ernesto smirked. Sure, kid. You want a message to get out? You'll need more than curiosity. You'll need courage. Diego's jaw tightened. I have plenty of that. Ernesto leaned closer. All right, listen. There's a gap under the east corner of the fence. It's small, but it's there. They patch it up every couple of weeks, so if you're serious about anything, that's your spot. But don't get caught, or you'll make things worse for everyone. Diego nodded, his mind racing. The gap was a chance, a slim one, but a chance nonetheless. The next day, during his meeting with Ms. Flores, Diego tested the waters. What happens if someone leaves? He asked carefully. Ms. Flores frowned. Leaves? You mean if a child is transferred to another facility? Diego shook his head. No, I mean if they leave without permission, like run away. Ms. Flores's expression darkened. Diego, I need you to understand something. This place isn't perfect, but it's safer for you than being out there alone. Running away would put you in even more danger. Do you understand? Diego nodded quickly, though his heart sank. He appreciated Ms. Flores's kindness, but he couldn't afford to wait for the system to work. not when time was slipping away. That evening, Diego gathered Luis and Ernesto in a quiet corner of the yard. "We have to act soon," Diego said, his voice steady, despite the nervous energy thrumming through him. "If we wait too long, we'll lose our chance." Luis's eyes widened. "You mean we're really doing this?" Ernesto crossed his arms. "It's risky, kid. You sure you're ready for what happens if you get caught?" Diego met his gaze without flinching. "I'm ready. I have to be." Ernesto nodded slowly. "All right, we'll need a distraction. Something big enough to draw the guards away from the yard." Diego's mind worked furiously. "The kitchen," he said. "If something goes wrong there, the guards will have to respond." Luis's face lit up. "Like a fire alarm." "Exactly," Diego said. "But we need to make sure no one gets hurt. This isn't about causing trouble. It's about creating an opportunity." The plan began to take shape. Ernesto would handle the distraction, using his connections in the kitchen to stage a harmless but urgent incident. Luis would keep watch and alert Diego when the coast was clear. And Diego, he would be the one to slip through the gap in the fence. As the day of the plan approached, Diego felt a mixture of fear and excitement. He thought of Sofia, Mateo, and his parents, their faces clear in his mind. This was for them, for their chance to be whole again. On the night of the escape, Diego sat on his mat, waiting for the signal. His hands were clammy, and his heart pounded in his chest. He glanced at Luis, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Ernesto stood near the door, his posture casual, but his eyes sharp. When the alarm finally blared through the building, chaos erupted. Guards shouted, children murmured in confusion, and staff members rushed toward the kitchen. Diego took a deep breath and darted toward the yard, Luis close behind. "Go," Luis whispered, pointing to the east corner of the fence. Diego dropped to his knees and scrambled toward the gap, his heart hammering in his chest. He wriggled through the narrow opening, the cold night air biting at his skin. As he emerged on the other side, Diego paused for a brief moment, his eyes scanning the dark expanse ahead. This was it. No turning back now. He turned to Luis, who was still watching from the other side of the fence. "Thank you," Diego whispered. Luis nodded, his face pale but resolute. "Find them," he said. "For all of us." With one last look at his friend, Diego took off into the night, his legs carrying him toward an uncertain future, but a determined goal. To reunite his family, no matter the cost. Diego ran until his lungs burned, the cold night air slicing against his skin. He didn't dare look back. The voices of guards shouting orders were muffled by the pounding of his heartbeat in his ears. All that mattered was moving forward, faster, farther. His shoes slapped against the cracked pavement as he reached the edge of the industrial neighborhood and darted into a dark alley. He crouched behind a dumpster, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The adrenaline that had carried him this far was beginning to wane, and for the first time since he slipped through the fence, fear crept in. What now? He had no map, no plan beyond reaching his parents and Mateo. Digging into his pocket, he pulled out the crumpled scrap of paper where he'd scrawled the address of the detention center Ms. Flores had mentioned. It wasn't close, but it was something. Diego wiped his face with the sleeve of his shirt, swallowing hard. He would figure it out. He had to. The following days were a blur of exhaustion and hunger. Diego avoided busy streets, sticking to back alleys and shadows. The little money he'd managed to save from odd jobs at the detention center was barely enough to buy a few snacks from corner stores. His stomach growled constantly, but he pushed the discomfort aside. At night, Diego found refuge where he could, an abandoned building, the back of a truck, once even a church whose doors had been left unlocked. He tried to keep himself warm with newspapers and cardboard, but the chill seeped into his bones. Still, he refused to give up. Each day brought him closer to the address on the paper, though the journey seemed endless. Finally, after nearly a week of traveling, Diego reached the outskirts of the detention center. It was a gray, imposing building surrounded by a tall chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. He stayed hidden behind a row of trees, his heart sinking as he realized how impossible it would be to get inside. Guards patrolled the perimeter, and the gates were heavily secured. He clenched his fists, his mind racing. He needed another way in. Maybe someone could help him. Someone sympathetic, like Senora Castillo had been. But who? The weight of his situation pressed down on him. He was just a kid, alone in a country that seemed determined to keep him apart from his family. As he sat hidden in the shadows, he spotted a delivery truck approaching the gate. His mind flashed with an idea. If he could somehow sneak into the truck. But as he crept closer, a sudden commotion drew his attention. A van was pulling out of the detention center, its headlights cutting through the dim evening light. Inside the van, Diego caught a glimpse of faces. His heart stopped. It was them. "Papa! Mama!" Diego's voice broke the stillness as he sprang from his hiding spot and ran toward the van. The guards at the gate shouted, their hands going to their weapons. Diego didn't care. He sprinted as fast as his legs would carry him, waving his arms desperately. "Stop! Get back!" a guard barked, stepping forward to block Diego's path. The van paused, the passengers inside craning their necks to see what was happening. Diego's mother's face appeared in the window, her eyes widening in shock and horror. "Diego!" she screamed, her hands pounding against the glass. "Ma!" Diego shouted back, tears streaming down his face as he struggled against the guard who had grabbed him. "Let him go!" Luis Rodriguez's voice boomed from inside the van, but the guards ignored him. Diego's father strained against the restraints holding him in place, his face contorted with fury. The van began to move again, and Diego's screams grew louder. "No, don't take them, please!" He clawed at the ground, trying to break free from the guard's grip, but it was no use. The van disappeared down the road, leaving Diego sobbing in the dirt. Hours later, Diego sat slumped against the fence, his body trembling with exhaustion and despair. The guards had let him go, but warned him to stay away. He had nowhere else to go. His parents were gone, taken to an unknown location, and he was no closer to finding Mateo. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. He was alone. Truly, utterly alone. For the next few days, Diego wandered the streets aimlessly. He scavenged for food, slept in doorways, and avoided anyone who might ask questions. The hope that had carried him this far was slipping through his fingers, replaced by a hollow ache. He couldn't stop replaying the moment the van drove away. His mother's anguished face seared into his memory. One night, as Diego huddled under an overpass, rain pouring around him, he thought about giving up. Maybe he should turn himself in to the authorities. At least then, he'd have a roof over his head and a chance to reunite with Sofia. But the thought of being trapped again, powerless to act, made his stomach turn. "I can't," he whispered to himself. "I have to keep going. For them." Weeks passed, and Diego's life on the streets became a grim routine. He learned which shelters were less crowded, where to find free meals, and how to avoid the watchful eyes of law enforcement. He met others like him, children and teenagers who had fallen through the cracks, each with their own stories of loss and survival. They formed a loose network, sharing tips and looking out for one another when they could. Diego's resolve never wavered. Every step he took, every hardship he endured, was for his family. He carried their faces in his heart, a constant reminder of what he was fighting for. And though the path ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. He wouldn't stop until he found them again. Diego's days on the street stretched into weeks, and each one tested his resilience in new ways. He grew thinner, his face hollow from hunger, but his spirit clung to the faint hope of reuniting with his family. The network of other children and teens he'd connected with became his lifeline. They shared what little they had, a loaf of bread here, an abandoned jacket there, and in return, Diego offered what he could, his determination and an unshakable drive to keep moving forward. One cold evening, Diego found himself sitting outside a small soup kitchen. The smell of warm food wafted through the air, and his stomach growled loudly. He shuffled inside, grateful for the kindness of strangers who didn't ask too many questions. He sat at a table in the corner, clutching his bowl of soup like a treasure. As he ate, a woman with soft eyes and silver streaks in her hair approached. "Is it okay if I sit here?" she asked in Spanish. Diego nodded, his guard up but curious. The woman set down her tray and studied him for a moment. "You look like you've been through a lot, mijo," she said gently. "Do you have someone looking out for you?" Diego hesitated, then shook his head. I'm looking for my family. My parents were taken away and I don't know where they are." The woman's expression softened further. "My name is Elena. I work with an organization that helps kids like you. Maybe we can help you find them." Diego's heart leapt at her words. "You can?" "We can try," Elena said, her voice steady. "But you'll have to trust me. Can you do that?" For the first time in weeks, Diego allowed himself to hope. "Yes," he whispered. The next few days were a whirlwind. Elena took Diego to a shelter where he was given clean clothes, warm meals, and a bed to sleep in. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt safe. Elena asked him for every detail he could remember about his family: names, dates, locations. She promised to do everything in her power to find them. While Elena worked tirelessly, Diego spent his days helping out at the shelter. He cleaned tables, played with younger children, and even helped with translating for newcomers. The work gave him purpose and kept his mind from wandering to dark places. Then, one afternoon, Elena called him into her office. Her face was calm, but there was a glimmer of something in her eyes. Hope, perhaps. "Diego, I have news," she said. "We've located your sister, Sophia. She's still in a detention center, but we're working on getting her released to a foster family." Diego's chest tightened. "And my parents? Mateo?" Elena's smile faded slightly. "Your parents. They've been deported. They're back in Mexico." The room seemed to tilt, and Diego gripped the edge of his chair. "No," he whispered. "I was supposed to find them." "I know this isn't the outcome you wanted," Elena said softly, "but we can still reunite you with Sophia. And Mateo. He's in a group home, but we can try to bring him here, too." Diego felt tears sting his eyes, but he blinked them back. "Can I talk to my parents? Can you help me call them?" "Of course," Elena said. That evening, Diego sat in Elena's office with a phone pressed to his ear. The connection crackled, and then he heard his mother's voice. "Diego!" she cried. "Estás bien, mi hijo?" Tears streamed down Diego's face as he choked out, "Sí, mamá, estoy bien. Los extraño mucho." "Nosotros también, mi amor," his mother said, her voice trembling. "Pero tienes que ser fuerte. Estamos orando por ti y por tus hermanos." His father's voice came next, steady and reassuring, despite the pain Diego could hear beneath it. "Escucha, Diego. Pase lo que pase, nunca pierdas la fe. Nos encontraremos de nuevo, te lo prometo." The call ended too soon, but it left Diego with a renewed sense of purpose. His parents were far away, but they were alive, and they believed in him. That had to be enough. Weeks turned into months. With Elena's help, Diego was reunited with Sophia. Their embrace was tearful and unbreakable, a moment Diego knew he would carry with him forever. Mateo joined them soon after, and though his time in the group home had left him wary and quiet, the bond between the siblings began to heal. Life wasn't perfect. They were placed in foster care, their future still uncertain. But they were together, and with Elena's guidance, they began to build a new kind of family, one rooted in resilience and hope. Diego never forgot his parents' promise. One day, he vowed, he would see them again. Until then, he would honor their sacrifices by living a life they could be proud of. For now, that meant surviving, learning, and holding his family close. Because no matter where they were still a family, and that was something no border could ever take away.